All right, welcome back to the series. So in the first 3 videos, we covered everything you kind of need to get started, some basic similarities, getting your interface set up, and understanding the basics in terms of how to set things up when it comes to recording. In this video, we're going to dive into some of the basic editing tools in Studio One versus Pro Tools. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to import some stems over here. Let's drag and drop these into the Arrange window. And also, let's do a save as. So this is now going to become video 04. We'll save. And you have the option over here. This is something we'll take a look at in the preferences. But anytime that you copy some audio files into the Studio One timeline, you have the option, do you want to copy these files, these external files, to the media folder? In most cases, the answer is going to be yes. Now, there might be the odd case where you're importing something just to have a look at it in a DAW, but you don't necessarily want to make a copy and add additional space to your hard drive, in which case you can click no, and as long as those audio files are not moved from whatever location they are, you should be good. But in this case, let's go ahead and click yes. Okay, I'm going to copy everything. I'm going to slide back to the very beginning of my timeline, and Command L, that's a really quick shortcut that allows you to select some audio events and kind of spot them to a very specific point on the timeline. Just a little side tip over here. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And what we're working with here are just some stems from something that I've mixed. Let's do the same thing in Pro Tools, actually. I'm going to hop over to Pro Tools, and we're going to go to File, and we're going to import audio. And we can either navigate to the folder that we have, but in this case, I think it might be easier just to open up the same Finder window. And let's just drag these right into the Arrange window in Pro Tools. And in here, now we have the exact same files. I'm just going to drag them back to the very beginning. All right. So when it comes to editing tools, one of the things that you're very much going to be used to if you work with Pro Tools, at least most people that I've spoken to, is the Smart tool. And what this does is it gives you different tools based on the different area that you've selected. So you can see here we have this hand tool, this little selection grabber tool at the bottom half from, let's say, 50% down. And in the top half, we have this cursor, which we can make selections, right? And then we also have our trim tool, and then we have our fade tool over here. Okay. So in Studio One, I think it was version 3.2, we basically have something that's very, very similar. So if you hover your cursor just over top of this little bracket over here, it says Link, Arrow, and Range Tools. Basically what this means is the exact same thing with slightly different icons in terms of the plugin, in terms of the mouse GUI. So we have a selection tool, which allows you to select things and move them. In addition to that, we have, or I should say, more like an arrow selection tool. And then we have our range selector. Right now, I'm on grid snapping mode, which I can disable or toggle by clicking N. And this allows you to make a range selection right over here in the top 50% of the region in terms of, or the audio event in terms of from the 50% mark up to the top. You can see we have the selection tool bottom. It's very, very similar to Pro Tools. In addition to that, we have this other tool. If we take a look at this over here, we have the ability to click, hold, and drag and slide this over. And then, of course, we have our fade tool. A fade tool in Pro Tools versus fade tool in Studio One. If we take a look at this, let me just zoom in a little bit, make this a little bit larger, and I'll use the T key. We have this icon that represents itself as this little box with the 2 different forms of shading. And then we can curve this. And in addition to that, we can also curve this by clicking Command F. We can choose some different options in terms of standard and the shape, the slope, whether it's equal power or equal gain. So this one, just as soon as you drag in the right area. In Studio One, this is just this box over here. Now we can drag, I just came from Pro Tools, I'm doing the opposite behavior over here, but this is dragging up and down. We can change the actual curve, and it also has a snapping behavior. So if you wanted equal power versus equal gain, notice that they call it linear and logarithmic, that as you snap, as you get towards the middle here, it will just automatically snap, assuming that you want this curve. And then you have varying degrees of this curve once you snap away from that default position. Now, another thing that's very, very different with respect to Pro Tools and Studio One is that Studio One functions as a selection-based smart groups, if you will. And we took a look at this in, I believe, video 1 with respect to how it works when mixing. That you can select different channels in the console or the sends or anything like that, and everything becomes relative. This is very much the same when we select multiple audio events, that any edits that we're doing with respect to something like a fade handle or anything like that, could be trimming, that if you have multiple audio events selected, that this becomes a relative move as well. Now, let's say that you had varying degrees of events that were trimmed. If you selected all of these and you did this, let's actually remove our grid snapping by clicking N. Notice that it's functioning now relative. And in addition to that, let's say that this one was logarithmic fade out with this curve over here. And then let's say that this one was linear, and let's say that this one was like this. If I selected all of these and I increase the curve of all of these, notice that they maintain their relative positioning or the relative distance between each other. So depending on how you like to work, this might be useful, or it might be something that you have to adapt to. Now, in addition to that, we don't necessarily have to select an audio event itself in order to access, for example, the fade handle. If you know where the fade handles are, you can see here that we don't have the event selected, but for example, I could be on this track and I could hover my cursor over here, and I have this pointer tool, which means I can adjust this fade. And also, as long as you get this icon and you kind of know what it means, even though you're not seeing that square, you can adjust things as well. Okay, so let's highlight all three of these and let's drag them all the way out. And notice as the one hit the max point, I was still able to drag the other two out as well. And then let's just drag this fade handle out. Okay, so this is a smart tool, and for all intents and purposes, I think if you're coming from Pro Tools, this is definitely something that you want to have enabled. Now, let's say that you are a Pro Tools user who also dabbles with Logic and you're used to that type of behavior, or maybe Cubase. In that case, you may find that the smart tool is just something that you're not interested in using. You would rather switch between these tools individually with hotkeys, or perhaps you just prefer to have the arrow tool, this grabber tool, this arrow tool. Maybe you just want to have this across the whole audio event versus having that separated spacing between the bottom half and the top half. In those cases, this is pretty straightforward. We have the arrow tool. Next up, we have the range tool. No matter where we select, in this case, when we're using the individual tools, we can make a range selection across an event or across multiple events. All right, next up we have the cutter tool. Now, this works really well if you have snapping enabled. So snapping enabled, this is something that we can do by clicking the shortcut or this area in the GUI. This just allows us to hover our cursor over an area and we can split. And this obviously would work if you had, for example, multiple audio events selected, and then you switched to the cutter tool, and I wanted to make a snip across all of them. I'd be able to cut all four of these because they were all selected. Okay, let's undo and bring ourselves back to all our events being the same. Now, let's say that you had made a cut over here and you wanted to select this and delete it. One other thing that you could do is you could use the eraser tool. So we'll switch to that. Now, the cool thing about the eraser tool is you don't necessarily have to have the audio event selected. You can just click anywhere and it will select the whole entire event. Now, if you have certain ones selected, like over here, here's another shortcut. This is something that we don't have in Pro Tools. Let's say you wanted to make a highlighted range selection across these three tracks for this specific area and double click. This would basically separate this. This would be the equivalent of in Pro Tools being like, let's see here. let me reset this. If I did something like this, where I had an area selected and I clicked the B to break everything. Now, with respect to the erase tool, as I said, it's one of these. I don't use it that much because, to be honest, we have the delete function. But I guess it can be useful if you prefer to edit this way. If you're coming from that style of workflow, that would work. That's another thing that you could do, is make a range selection, highlight, and swap over to the eraser tool and erase that. All right, let's get back to all of these events being as they were. Okay, next up we have a paint tool. Now this is very, very much specific to automation. So automation is something we're going to take a look at a little bit later. But for a moment, let's expand our envelopes over here. And then by default, we have a volume envelope and we have a pan envelope. This is something that can be set in, where is it? It's in automation. By default, envelopes for new audio tracks, volume, and pan. Generally, I don't use mute really at all when I'm working with audio. If I want to mute audio, I would simply just mute the actual clip or audio event. So this is something that you can take a look at if you would prefer to have automation envelope for all three of these by default, so that every audio track that you set up will have these. This is something you can set up. One thing I want to point out while we're in these preferences, and this is hugely important, especially if you're coming from Pro Tools, is automatically create automation tracks for channels. This is something we're going to focus on a little bit further in the next video, but this is something I just definitely want to point out if you're getting ahead of the series a little bit and you're messing around with things. Because basically what this means is that, I don't know if you recall using Logic, that like I mentioned, in Studio One, we have tracks and channels. And by default, if you create a bus or an effects channel, you don't automatically get an automation track in the arrange window for that. Something we're going to revisit, but this is worth checking out. Okay. All right. Moving on. So we're looking at the paint tool. Depending on what mode you have this in, this is obviously in a freehand mode. If you click this little area in the bottom, so you can see that we have a line. This is pretty self-explanatory. All these tools we're going to focus on in the next one, in the next video. So, but this is where you would find that if you're looking to paint in your automation and specific, I guess, types or specific curves or specific shapes. Now, next up, we have the mute tool. This is where we mute audio events. So I can click, hold, and drag across things, or I can just click these ones individually if I wanted to. The way that I typically use this is I actually have this set up as my secondary tool, because I like to either make a selection of audio events and then do this, or for example, maybe I might just want to drag across very specific audio events. Okay. Next up, we have our bend tool. Our audio bend tool is very much like Pro Tools Elastic Audio. And I think we'll probably get into this in detail in a later video when we look at quantizing based on slicing and time stretching. But the basic premise of this is that, let's select this over here. We have the ability to, let's go to the audio bend menu. We have the ability to detect transients. We can right click. We'll go to event, audio. I don't actually use a lot of these menus a lot, so sometimes I'm a little lost finding them. I use shortcuts, but you can detect transients, and then you have the ability to adjust the sensitivity of them. And then if you're on this audio bend tool, which is this one over here, then you can kind of click, hold, and drag, and you can adjust the timing or the relative timing between these. Like I said, this is something that we are going to look at in a later video. Let's switch back to the pointer tool. Shift Q will restore or reset my timing. And also, for now, let us remove all the bend markers. Like I said, this is something we're going to look into in a later video. Next, we have the listen tool. So let me just click anywhere in the timeline over here. And we basically have the ability to just listen or solo this out. It functions like a solo, but the benefit over here is, let's say that you had these two tracks soloed and you temporarily wanted to use the listen tool on this track, but you didn't want to clear the solo state. These are still soloed, so I can kind of I can kind of hop in and use this as just to listen to a specific section. Now, when you're starting Studio One, this is probably something I should have mentioned in the very first video, but this info view, it's definitely worth leaving on, because what it does is it gives you a complete update, or rather information on anything as you hover your cursor over relevant areas in the GUI. It will tell you, it will give you hints rather, in terms of things that you can do. And it just happens to be a useful tool. Okay, audio bend. This particular view has to do with when you're doing any quantizing or you're working with bend markers. This is the submenu that we use, and this has everything. I'm going to hide this info track for a moment. And this has everything that you would need in terms of being able to see, show, hide your bend markers, adjust the threshold for your detections, your detection modes, the ability to analyze things, stuff to do with different time stretching modes, and when we're talking about slicing, more like a beat detective workflow, all of these options are available within this submenu, and we can show or hide this directly over here. Okay, next up we have strip silence. This functions similar to Pro Tools strip silence, but not quite the same. To be honest with you, I don't really use it that much. This is one of the things that I don't feel is quite at the level where Pro Tools strip silence was very, very easy to use. For me, I never got along with this that well, hence I don't really use it. Then we have a quantize menu over here, which has to do with quantizing. This could be audio or it could be for instrument tracks. And then last but not least, we have the macros area where we can load different macro pages for different tasks that we might want to do. So for example, there's one for music editing, which should be MIDI. There's one for music creation, which again is MIDI. We have Explore macros. We have a podcast macro toolbar over here. We have a track visibility macro toolbar, the global or the main one. So, and this is something that can also be further edited in the macro organizer, where you can create your own custom macros. This is something we are going to look at in a later video. So this is the basics in terms of the editing tools. Whenever you see an audio event that looks like this, this is the audio bend option. So a key over here is you open up the audio bend menu, and you can show hide the bend marker. If you deselect this option, then your audio event will look normal. Maybe you did it by accident, you're not sure where it is. Another area that we can find this is in the track inspector. There's a lot of information over here. So if we adjust this, I believe our bend marker option is there. There's a lot of kind of like secondary options or shortcut options where we can get into some of the similar features. Now we have things, for example, like gain, fade in, fade out. If you want to, you could adjust this from the inspector. I never do. You have the option to normalize. You can transpose, tune, but a lot of these are also right-click options. For example, here we can enter a file tempo, speed up, tune, transpose. These types of things are all accessible directly from this area over here. Two other things that I want to point out is that in Pro Tools, if we hover over here, we have our little mixer icon, and this allows us to adjust our static clip gain. So Pro Tools has static clip gain, which is adjustable through this fader over here. And again, holding down the command key will give you fine increments in this particular area. But then also we have, if we go into clip, or rather view, and we go into clip, where is it here? It's the clip gain line. There we go. Then we have the ability to basically create these different nodes, and then we can adjust these different nodes together. Let me select this one over here. So we have a static clip gain, and we have a dynamic clip gain. This is very, very similar in Studio One. In Studio One, our static clip gain is going to be, well, it's called event gain in Studio One. It's going to be up top over here. This is something we can adjust like this, or we can command click to reset it to default. So this will set our static clip gain level. But then in addition to that, let's reset this. We can right click, and we have the option to see the gain envelope. Now this is essentially the exact same as Pro Tools clip gain. We can create automation nodes. We can adjust these. We can even curve our automation nodes like this, which is Really, really nice. Or we can do the standard approach. Let's go back to our Smart tool over here, Link, Arrow, and Range tools, where we can basically hover over the top half, and then we can make adjustments like this. And then any area that is where two nodes are sitting, if you hover your cursor over here, we can just click hover, and then we can make adjustments to these quite easily. And then, of course, if you wanted to take a look at some of your paint tool options, these would work here as well. A simple right click, we have the option to either hide or show the gain envelope. Sometimes if I have really busy clip gain, or if the gain envelope that I'm adjusting in Studio One is all over the place and it might be visually distracting, then I'll just right click and I'll hide it. But notice that the effects of the clip gain are still there. Let's bring it back in. We have another option to bypass this entirely if you wanted to A/B. Maybe you weren't sure as to whether what you were doing was helping or not helping, then we can bypass this. Generally speaking though, I love clip gain. This is actually something that we only got somewhat recently, I believe in version 5, and this was pretty much the one major thing that I was really missing from Pro Tools when I made the move to Studio One. So let's deselect the gain envelope. We will hide that for the time being. Okay, a couple other things I want to talk about in Studio One is some really, really basic editing tools. So for example, in Pro Tools, one thing that I would use all the time was, I forget, what is it called now? Command focus? No, keyboard focus, yeah. So this would allow you to do things like, for example, things like cut, things like paste, things like adjusting, like trimming top and tail trims by using A and S, those types of things. I was using them all the time in Pro Tools. Let's reset everything back so it looks somewhat normal. We'll bring it back to its original state. So that could be something like C and, for example, V, these quick commands using this keyboard focus, or I can't remember what it was called. Yeah, keyboard focus. In Studio One, let's cover some basic things. So for duplicate, which in Pro Tools is Command D, in Studio One, duplicate is going to be basically just D. It's a very simple key command to remember. You just click D, and that will get you to be able to duplicate something. And then the other commands in terms of your basic copy and paste is Command C and Command V. Pretty much standard, whether you're using basic word processor or any DAW. So Command C and Command V. Now, one very important thing that I want to make note of here. In Pro Tools, when you make a selection, for example, using either the selection tool or the grabber tool over here, notice what happens to the cursor position, right? If I was to trim this one across to here, and to trim this one across to, let's say here, as I select, the cursor position is following, because I believe it's the link, timeline, and edit selection. So 90% of the time, or like 99% of the time when I was in Pro Tools, I always had this feature on because I would want that selection to be linked so that if I click something, my cursor would follow suit over here. Now, if this is deselected and I click this, notice this remains on 1 while I'm selecting these different areas. It's constantly remaining on 1. For me, this was pretty much always selected. I never really had cases where I wanted that to be deselected. In Studio One, something similar to that is going to be cursor follows edit position. Now notice as I select these events by using the Smart tool, and in fact, if I was to trim some of these over so we can mimic that exact same type of workflow that we're doing, as I'm selecting here, notice over here that this doesn't change. This is locked to bar 33. If we go return to 0, we go back to the very beginning. I'm selecting these, they're locked over here. Also worth noting really quickly, if you want to see a large time display that's basically following what this is showing, this is something that you can activate in the view. Sometimes this might be useful in an event where you wanted to select an audio event, but you didn't want to move your cursor. Now, there's two things I want to talk about here really quickly, and then we're going to wrap this video up. There's a menu shortcut, and it's in Transport. It's called Locate Selection. And what this basically allows you to do is snap your cursor to wherever the selection is made. So in this case, I have a range selection made. If I click L, it's going to snap my cursor to the beginning. In this case, I've made an event selection. If I click L, it'll snap it to the beginning. Let's make a range selection, click L. What happens if we select all three of these events? It's going to snap it to the beginning of the very first one. So things like this. If you're working with the cursor follows edit position deselected and you're decoupling the event selection from the actual cursor position in the timeline, then that's a very quick command that you can use to just bring yourself to there. Now, there's benefits to working both of these ways, and I think a lot of it has to do if you're whatever you're used to in terms of if you started off with another DAW or if you started off with Pro Tools. In my case, I would say 98% of the time, I have cursor follows edit position on. That means that whatever I click, notice that my cursor is snapping to that. I think for a lot of areas, that's a good thing. The only time I don't want this to happen is, for example, if I need independent control of that. Now, there's something else to bring up is that if, for example, let's say that I didn't want that to happen. Let's say that I wanted my cursor to remain here, but I wanted to select all three of these events. I could then select this over here, and then notice that my cursor remains here. And another case would be, for example, if I wanted to move this over and I wanted to have all three of these selected, there's another shortcut we can use, which is Command L, which basically allows us to snap all of our audio events over to one particular area based on cursor position. Now, one other thing I want to point out is going back to what we said in the first video. If we go to our keyboard shortcuts, notice that the last keyboard command or key command that I used, it will be highlighted and available over here. Move to cursor, and it's showing what I used, and it shows the key command over here. So just in case you ever wanted to do that. Let's undo this, and in fact, let's pull all of these back. I pulled back the beginning one, so it only went back to the beginning. But if I pulled back this one, notice that all of these are going to continue to move relative to each other, like we talked about in the previous video. There's another edit mode up here that I don't use too much, which is a ripple edit mode. And when this is enabled, basically, if you delete any particular area, then it's automatically going to shuffle all the tracks back. And also, let me take my snapping off for a minute. This also goes by if you trim things or if you adjust the boundaries. Oh, this is a good one to point out too. Let's take this off for a moment. Let me quickly just double click. I can double click my cursor in any area to separate this. Now, notice in this case, we have this icon over here, which is basically allows us to trim the event boundaries. But notice that as we move to the bottom, it turns from this singular icon with the two triangles on the side to what almost looks like two golf clubs or something at the bottom. When we adjust this one versus this one will allow us to trim, but this one over here will trim, but it will keep the event boundaries butted up against each other. So if we hop into Pro Tools for a moment and I break this, notice in this area over here that as we pull this across, we're trimming. As we pull this one across, we're trimming into this area. In Studio One, it's just a slight difference in the GUI in terms of how these two look. So that's one thing to be aware of, just in terms of how this in terms of how it works, rather. Now, one other thing I want to point out is that in Pro Tools, when we're adjusting some of these clips, let's say that we're in slip mode right now. If I'm adjusting this, and I'm in slip mode, and I hold down the Command key, let me adjust my grid value to something a lot bigger, like, for example, a half note. Whoops, wrong one. So I'm adjusting this. Now, if I hold down Command, this is going to snap in half increments. It's a little bit hard to see here, so let's come to here. So we're snapping in half note increments over here on the grid, and then if I let go, this is moving freely on the grid. In Studio One, we have something that's very, very similar. It's just a slightly different command. So, for example, I'm adjusting this audio event over here, but if I hold down Shift, now it's snapping to my grid based on the time base that I've set. And this basically is for anything. Anytime you're making any edits, this is free from the grid, but as I hold down Shift, now we're snapping to the grid. Now let's say I had grid snapping enabled, and I was making some adjustments. So this is snapping to the grid by default. Now, if I hold down Shift, I'm relieving myself from my grid snapping. So depending on what you want to do, this is just something to take into consideration, that you can temporarily toggle away from the grid when doing your editing moves just by holding Shift versus by holding Command in Pro Tools. All right, that's a lot of information to digest. Hopefully you can rewatch this, or well, I'd say what's even better is just to boot Studio One up and drag some audio events in and just practice, just see. It's a little bit different in terms of the locations, or the drag behavior on the fades, for example, is up and down instead of left to right like we see in Pro Tools, but I would recommend just giving it a shot and practicing some of these. Now, in the next video, we are going to tackle the basics of automation in terms of similarities and differences. So we'll catch you for more in the next video.